Okay, welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we will discuss one of our first major endocrine disorders, right? That being diabetes mellitus, right? In one of the previous videos, we had discussed general mechanisms of action associated with insulin, glucagon, target tissues and organs of the liver, skeletal muscle, right? And the pancreas involvement. So in this video, we'll be talking about really dysfunction associated with those organs, that endocrine physiology as relates to this condition known as diabetes mellitus. Right? Diabetes mellitus. Let's just kind of start with etymology, the kind of the derivation of the word, because I think it's be critical for our subsequent information about complications, signs, and symptoms associated with this condition, right? So overall, if we look at the breakdown of this word, what we're really kind of talking about is filtering of the sweet. Right? Filtering of the sweet. Diabetes, derivation from the Greek, meaning to filter, right? To siphon. Right, so we're really talking about maybe the kidney role, right? So there's a lot of kidney complications associated with diabetes mellitus. So we're talking about kidney related to diabetes, filtering or siphoning, right? And then mellitus coming from the Latin, so it's a kind of a Greek-Latin mixture, right? Mellitus meaning the sweet, right? So with the sweet meaning sugar, right? So we talked about this last discussion in that when we talk about endocrine disorders related to blood glucose homeostasis, which is really what we're talking about here, right? We have an excess amount of sugar, glucose, in the bloodstream. We don't like storing excessive sugar in the bloodstream, right? We have 3 locations where we store our sugar in the blood. So glucose storage in the body comes in 3 forms. One, we can store it in the blood. Not ideal, but very little, right? We like to store very little in the blood. When it accumulates, which we'll be referring to later on, which is really the condition of diabetes, it causes a lot of health complications, right? It's very deleterious, very negative to the body to store glucose, excessive amounts of glucose in the blood. I call it candy caning. It kind of coats all of your internal viscera with this kind of candy sugary coating, and the physiology, the organs, the bloodstream, the heart, the kidneys, the eyes, the brain, the nerves, all begin to experience dysfunction when you have this excessive amount of candy, glucose in the bloodstream. So we only want it in the bloodstream in very little amounts. We want it for immediate needs of the brain and metabolic needs of the tissue. But for the most part, we want to be getting it out of the blood and storing it into target areas, right? Where we like to store our glucose is in 2 other locations, which we mentioned, right? One would be in the liver, that would be second, right? We store it in the liver in the form of glycogen. We don't store glycogen in the blood. Once again, glycogen, as mentioned previously, is a big spider web of interconnected glucose molecules. It's referred to as a polymer. Polymer, polymer. A polymer is a complex structure made up of simple repeating units, right? So it's individual glucose molecules, if I have it listed here as G, all linked together in a giant spider web, right? All linked together, right? That is glycogen. All these individual simple sugars linked together. When we need a glucose molecule, we simply break the bond, right, and liberate the glucose used for energy. If we need it for energy, that's how we derive it. That process we referred to in the past video, and that's really glycogenolysis, the cutting of glycogen. So that's what we do in the liver, right? The most abundant place, more than 90% of our sugar, is stored in the skeletal muscle. Right? That's number 1. Right? Once again, that is stored as glycogen. Right? The storage form of glucose. Right? So those are the 3 locations. We don't want a lot of it in the blood, right? We want most of it in the liver and the skeletal muscle, okay? So we want to get it out, right? When it builds up, we want to, the body's going to try to get it out. If the storage capabilities of the liver and the skeletal muscle are maximized, and I call it the sponge is saturated, and we can't get any more glucose in, right? Or, as we'll refer to here in a little bit, there's a dysfunction, as a complication. We're having a hard time getting the glucose out of the blood because of the transport problem, right? The body's going to look to excrete it, right? And how does it predominantly excrete it? Through the kidneys, hence the filtering of the sweet. So if we were looking to maybe diagnose, we'll have a section on diagnostics here in a brief little bit, right? As we begin to look to diagnose glucose, one of the things we can look for is to try to detect glucose in the urine. If we're finding glucose in the urine, which it shouldn't be, there should be no glucose in the urine, it's indicating that there's an excessive amount of glucose in the blood, right? And that we are looking to excrete it through urine, right? So hence the sweet starts showing up in the urine, right? The glucose begins showing up in as we excrete it out through diuresis through the kidney, okay? So that's the derivation of the name of diabetes mellitus, to filter out the sweet when you have excessive sugar stored in the bloodstream, okay? So a little etymology, background, little refresher on physiology here, right? Just to kind of get us up to speed for this pathology, right? So, good. Next page, okay? So, there are 2 major forms. We'll talk about other forms of diabetes in a little bit. The 2 major forms of diabetes mellitus, right? I usually abbreviate it as DM. So if you ever see me write it as DM, that's what I'm referring to as diabetes mellitus, the filtering of the sweet, right? Type 1 diabetes mellitus would be one form, right? And type 1 diabetes mellitus, and once again, usually see me abbreviate as type 1 DM. So you guys see that on your assignment, right? This is the abbreviation of a type 1 diabetes mellitus, right? Type 1 diabetes mellitus is a condition in which we lose the ability to produce and secrete insulin, right? So the pancreas loses its ability to make insulin, right? Loses its ability to make insulin, right? It is classified. How does it go about losing it, right? It goes about losing its ability through what's believed to be an autoimmunity issue. Right? Autoimmunity is a causative issue. It's an etiology, right? Etiology. So the etiology, the cause of the condition is autoimmunity, right? Autoimmunity is, as it sounds, auto meaning the self, and the immune system is now attacking itself, right? The immune system of one's body, for those who are living with type 1 diabetes mellitus, right, begin to produce what's referred to as autoantibodies, right? It's something that will show up in a diagnostic, right? Autoantibodies. Autoantibodies, as we know, antibodies are products of the immune system that are designed to flag specific molecules, right, pathogens in the body for the immune system then to become amplified and begin to attack and remove that invading pathogen. So what seems to happen here is that the immune system begins to make autoantibodies that target the cells we talked about before that are responsible for making insulin, right? They target these beta cells in the islets of Langerhans, so these islet cells. Right? The immune system then begins to, that's how they get spelled. ISLET? My spelling stinks. Let me correct that, right? Islet cells, right, you learn from me is, I'm getting the physiology. I know the physiology, but my spelling stinks, right? So it's a risk for doing these types of live videos. But the beta cells located in the islets of Langerhans begin to become targeted by the immune system and destroyed, right? So as a result, one loses its ability to produce insulin. Insulin is needed to help remove glucose out of the blood and move it into target storage areas as referred to previously, that being the liver and the skeletal muscle predominantly. The most of it's the skeletal muscle, right? So really the target of insulin, if you had to pick one, it's going to be a skeletal muscle related issue, right? So we lose the ability of the liver, the adipose tissue, skeletal muscle to be able to recognize, do insulin-related signaling, right? Just as a brief introduction to this, so what we're talking about is if we have a cell, right? My students will call this an arc. An arc, sometimes referred to, I do so many of them, they comedically refer to it as the arc of death because I do so many of them in my courses, right? So this is my lack of artistic capability to draw the cell membrane, right? So this could be the cell membrane on any cell in the body, right? It could be skeletal muscle, liver, adipose tissue, brain, right? They all express the insulin receptor, right? So on the surface of the cell, there is an insulin receptor, right? So this R at the end is for receptor, right? When we have high blood sugar, right? Well, so we have a condition, we know this term by now, hyperglycemia. All right, we have, let me erase that. A little skip on my pen there, sorry. So we have a condition of hyperglycemia. Maybe we just eaten a meal, right? So we call that postprandial. So if you ever see it on a medical form of postprandial, that means I've just eaten, right? Postprandial. So we've just eaten a meal, maybe it's lunch, and we wind up with, a temporary excursion, an elevation in blood glucose. As that glucose leaves the digestive system, it gets into the blood. We have a condition of hyperglycemia. We want to, once again, we know our negative feedback. We want to now take this sugar. It maybe it's 100 and, we'll kind of just to put a number, we'll say it's 130 milligrams per deciliter, right? We know our homeostatic, if there's no diabetes, right? We know that's above what we want. We want it to be less than 100 and above 60. So the body's now going to respond to remove this excess of sugar out of the blood and try to get it into storage. So what's going to happen, right? So this is kind of maybe step one. Step two is the pancreas is going to secrete insulin, right? So the pancreas, you know my drawing by now, it stinks, right? But the pancreas now begins to secrete insulin, right? So we wind up with a condition, ideally of hyperglycemia, and the name for this elevation in insulin is referred to as hyperinsulinemia. So hyperinsulinemia. So right after you eat, you wind up with both of these, right? You wind up with hyperglycemia, a condition of elevated sugar. The body responds by secreting insulin, so you wind up temporarily with an issue of elevated insulin, known as hyperinsulinemia. So the suffix on that emia means condition of. So a condition of excessive insulin, which is needed, right? That insulin, which I'm going to draw as a diamond here, right, has compatible binding to the insulin receptor, so hormone ligand interaction, right? So the insulin binds onto the insulin receptor, right? I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Maybe if you're interested, I can certainly post a greater video, but what happens is we get activation of what's referred to as insulin-mediated or controlled signaling. Molecules will get activated inside of the cell. Maybe one of the big ones, maybe just to kind of throw it out there, is a molecule, they all have funky names, right, is a protein called AKT. That's a big one. So if you go into any of the scientific literature, AKT, it's a kinase, the K standing for kinase, so it has enzyme properties. So as insulin binds onto the insulin receptor, we get activation. The receptor actually communicates with molecules inside of the cell, right? So if this is a skeletal muscle cell, we'll get activation. And the way it works is, just briefly, this, like we talked about with ATP. ATP gets activated by phosphorylating, putting a phosphate group on ADP, right? I can just imagine your faces now. You're probably just falling asleep now because you don't want to go back to to relearning that, to the ATP to ADP. But the way we deal with metabolism is we take adenosine diphosphate, we add this phosphate group, this phosphate element to it, and now we get ATP, which is the stored version of energy inside of their cells. It's the same thing here, right? We're taking a phosphate group and we're adding it on, we're conjugating it on to the AKT molecule, the protein, right? So in this instance, this activates this phosphorylation event, which is stimulated by insulin binding onto the insulin receptor. That process of insulin binding the insulin receptor loads this phosphate group onto the AKT and activates it, right? So this is our step 1, 2, we'll call this step 3, right? Insulin binding to the insulin receptor. The fourth step was AKT becoming phosphorylated and activated. AKT is now activated, right? And as a result, what happens is AKT then communicates to a molecule known as a glucose transporter. So it tells glucose transporters, GLUTs in abbreviation, glucose, GLU transporter. It tells glucose transporters to move to the cell membrane. Glucose transporters are usually housed inside the cell, and they'll only go to the cell membrane when they're told to by this AKT molecule, when it's activated. So as a result, this GLUT molecule, right, I'm going to call this GLUT, G-L-U-T, is right here, allows now, basically what happens is it's a transport. It's a little, like a donut that embeds itself into the cell membrane and punches a hole into it temporarily to allow glucose now to enter the cell. So I'm going to call glucose as a G, right? So glucose is now inside of the cell. So what number am I up to? So 4, this will be step 5. Step 6 is glucose entering the cell. So now glucose is able to move out of the blood into the muscle and be stored. That's the general overview of how insulin-mediated glucose uptake works in most cells of the body. There are exceptions. Liver can operate a little bit specially, but skeletal muscle certainly will operate like this. This is where 90% of your sugar is stored, okay? So that's why we can put our focus on, as an example, if you're looking for something specific, this is how muscle would operate, okay? So as a review again, we eat a meal. Let me change my colors here, right? We eat a meal, right? Postprandial, blood sugar goes up. As a response to that, the pancreas senses that elevation in glucose, right? These, as we referred to previously, these islets of Langerhans, these beta cells located in an area have a glucose sensing mechanism. They will secrete now insulin, right? That insulin now binds onto the insulin receptor, right? The insulin receptor then becomes activated. As a result, it communicates into the cell, will activate this molecule known as AKT through phosphorylation. It'll put a phosphate group on AKT, which is the activating step for AKT. AKT then tells GLUT4, hey, we have a lot of sugar out in the blood. Go to the membrane and let it in, right? Because glucose can't get into the cell without a helper. It needs, if you go back to your physiology, once again, don't go to sleep on me, just hang in there. But if you remember back, this idea of hydrophilic and hydrophobic, right? Glucose is hydrophilic, meaning it likes to be in a water-based environment, meaning it dissolves in water, right? The cell membrane is a fatty-based system, so that classic line of oil and water doesn't mix. So the glucose that's in the blood can't get across the cell membrane very easily because it's this incompatibility between hydrophobic, hydrophilic. It's a problem, right? So when the glucose molecule bumps up against the membrane, it can't get in, right? It needs an opening or a pore, and that's the job of the glucose transporter, is to create a little hole in this fatty-based membrane, right, and allow the glucose, which is hydrophilic, to get into the water-based environment inside of the cell. So extracellular to intracellular. We refer to that as facilitated diffusion, right? Facilitated diffusion, right? So if you listen to this video, once again, as I keep encouraging you, anything I write or anything I say should be being transposed into your own notes, right? So you should have, right now, although I'm not writing down facilitated diffusion because I don't want to muddy too much of the figure and get you all confused, but you should be writing down facilitated diffusion, which you remember back from your physiology, meaning diffusion is a molecule moving across a membrane from high concentration to low concentration, right? That's diffusion. So in this case, we have a high concentration of sugar in the blood. We want to move it into the relatively low environment inside of the cell, but it needs a helper. That's facilitated. It can't just get across. The facilitated aspect of this is the GLUT transporter. So that's facilitated diffusion for hydrophilic molecules, right? Hydrophilic meaning liking water. Hydro, prefix water. Philia from the Greek meaning to like or to love, right? So glucose is a water-loving molecule. It dissolves easy. If you have sugar in your coffee in the morning, you know it dissolves. It's hydrophilic. It likes to dissolve into water, okay? So that's our review of basic insulin kind of mediated physiology, right? Maybe little cell signaling in there, little molecular, just to kind of have some fun with some details. So that's how things should operate. Once again, in order to understand pathology, we have to be able to understand the quote-unquote normal, healthy, expected response, right? So that is the expected response under postprandial, post-eating conditions, right? So now diabetes mellitus type 1, we'll talk about type 2, right, are breaks in this system, this homeostatic negative feedback system, right, becomes broken. Hence, we wind up with a problem of chronic hyperglycemia, which we can't move sugar out of the blood and into the tissue, right? And we wind up with complications associated with this chronic hyperglycemia, where blood sugars can go well north of 100, into the 200s, 300s, 400s, right? I have had a student who took my class, and they came back and they told me they were kind of excited because they were working as a scribe in the emergency room, meaning they work close with the physicians and they take all the notes, that a patient showed up in the emergency room and they did a blood glucose assessment and it came back as 1,000, like it was like 1,082, and the student couldn't believe it because we've taken this class and you've heard values a little north of 100. This patient had a blood glucose value of 1,000, right? So that's a major concern. Right? That's a major concern. That can lead to real problems of coma, seizures, death, all sorts of problems, okay? So anyway, that's the negative feedback, right? So now if we kind of explore a little bit about this mechanism of action of type 1 diabetes, right? In type 1 diabetes now, what happens is the beta cells located in the islets or Langerhans of the pancreas, right, get destroyed, right, by the autoimmunity, right? The autoimmunity, these autoantibodies will bind onto the beta cells. The immune system's cells will attack and destroy the beta cells. And as a result, we start to lose our ability to secrete insulin into the blood in response to the hyperglycemia challenge, right? The input, right? So as a result, we don't get this. All of this goes away. This insulin-mediated signaling goes away, right? And we lose the ability to locate, or what's called translocate, or move glucose transporter to the cell membrane. And as a result, the blood sugar, the sugar in the blood, cannot move itself easily inside of the cell. So what does it do? It sticks around the bloodstream. Literally, pun intended. It sticks around the bloodstream, begins to coat all of the internal environment of the cell. So we see this linkage between this metabolic syndrome, right? This metabolic syndrome is a big issue. We referred to that, I think, previously. The metabolic syndrome is this linkage between when we have this diabetes type of condition linked to cardiovascular disease and obesity, right? That's the metabolic syndrome. This where we start to see this crosstalk, the Venn diagram between diabetes mellitus, right? Cardiovascular disease and heart attack and stroke, right? Those are the kind of the major impact. Let me make that a little bit bigger for you, okay? So the metabolic syndrome, this metabolic syndrome idea, once again, is this Venn diagram between, this connection between type 2 diabetes. Let me just make a new page for you, that'd be easier, right? There we go, better, okay? So this idea, once again, of the metabolic syndrome is this crosstalk, this Venn diagram again between diabetes mellitus, heart disease, maybe heart attack, right? Myocardial infarction. And let me change my colors again. A little green, I like green, right? And this idea of stroke. We'll talk about stroke in more detail when we get to cardio. So you get the heart disease. Heart disease is really about, a heart attack, right? Insufficient blood flow delivery to the heart, leading to dysfunction of the heart. Stroke is associated largely with the major contributor for stroke. We're talking about the brain, lack of blood flow to the brain, causing neuronal and brain death, right? Ischemia, lack of blood flow, hypoxia, lack of oxygen to the brain. So this idea of the inability to handle sugar is contributed to this idea and this interrelationship between, right, this kind of crosstalk area between all these, right? Stroke, heart disease, diabetes, this Venn diagram interaction. This is referred to as the metabolic syndrome, right? So it's not just about, excessive sugar in the blood, what's the big deal? Well, it's going to impact a whole bunch of different pathologies and health of different systems, right? So, right, so that's that link there, right, of this idea of the metabolic syndrome we need to be aware of, right? And we'll be talking about heart disease and stroke here coming up soon, okay? So going back to type 1 diabetes, right? It's really, once again, it's the lack of insulin is the problem, right? The lack of insulin is the problem, right? I want you to recognize that, this lack of insulin being the issue, right? So, okay, so sorry for that blank space, right? I'm just getting my notes in order here, okay? So, in terms of the prevalence of type 1 diabetes, right? The prevalence of type 1 diabetes. I'll get my pen back. Right? Prevalence of type 1 diabetes, right? It roughly impacts about 5% of the population in the U.S. have been diagnosed and living with type 1 diabetes, so it's significant. It is prevalent. It is a prevalent condition, 5%. It's about 2.7 million, 1.7 million People in the U.S. living with type 1 diabetes mellitus. Right, so millions of people living with diabetes. Millions of people. So it's about maybe 4.85% of the U.S. population living with type 1 diabetes. Right, living with type 1 diabetes. So it's a significant condition that we have to try to resolve, and there's a lot of effort going in to try to cure and find treatments for type 1 diabetes mellitus. Right now, really the major treatment, right, associated with type 1 diabetes, if we're looking for the major treatment, what is that major treatment? So I'm going to give you a moment to think about it before I tell you, right? What is the major treatment associated with type 1 diabetes, right? So type 1 diabetes, once again, you have to go back to understand how does normal physiology operate, right? In this case, type 1 diabetes is the loss of insulin, right? So the major treatment paradigm associated with this condition is associated with what I refer to as exogenous insulin administration. Individuals who are diagnosed and living with type 1 diabetes have to take daily insulin, right? And it's gotten easier over the years. You yourself may be living with this condition. It is very prevalent, right? About every 3 semesters or so, I will have a student in class living with type 1 diabetes, right? And it has gotten easier, right? Used to be through injections, right? You can't really orally take insulin. It gets broken down by the digestive system very easily, so you have to bypass the digestive system, and also you want more immediate action. So you used to have to inject it, right? But now there are individuals living with insulin pumps, right? So how do we administer this? Usually these days it's through an insulin pump, right? Individuals will wear this pump, and it'll administer the insulin through a port, right? That insulin pump is usually interacting with a glucose monitor, right? What's called a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor. And you might see that sometimes on the upper arm of individuals. It's really just a needle that goes in maybe a centimeter or so in through the skin, into the subcutaneous tissue, and it's constantly monitoring. And these days with technology, is providing that information to their phones about their constant levels of glucose. Right? So as the glucose levels are changing, they get immediate feedback to their phone, and it also can communicate to the pump to administer insulin when needed, right? So insulin was the first laboratory synthesized protein, right? So we know a lot of information about insulin and so forth. So that's how we have to really treat type 1 diabetes right now, is through this exogenous delivery of insulin. But with that said, we're learning a lot more, and that's what research is so wonderful is we're trying to make advancements in the care. So I'd encourage you to look at the course in news. I posted an article on the latest kind of biological approach for treating type 1 diabetes, involving the use of stem cell technology to inject islet cells, beta cells, really into the bloodstream to help individuals not have to rely so much on type 1 on insulin and exogenous insulin, meaning they can kind of maybe somewhat replace the defunct and damaged beta cells. So please go ahead and check that article. It's a wonderful new promise in the treatment and helping individuals manage type 1 diabetes, because it is a challenge. It's gotten easier with technology, but it requires constant maintenance, right, associated with the blood glucose, because the pancreas is just not doing a job of being able to respond to glucose challenges by being able to produce and secrete insulin, right? The other kind of tangential issue I want to bring forward with living with type 1 diabetes, once again, it's absolutely critical to be able to maintain blood glucose, right? But We also got to be concerned with type 1 diabetes and this other, I want to link it to our other condition we talked about, hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia, meaning too low a blood sugar, right? So this is a concern that has to be at top forefront of individuals living with type 1 diabetes and trying to manage their blood glucose levels. It's not only allowing the blood sugar to get too high, but also we don't want excursions too low, right? If we get conditions less than 60 milligrams per deciliter, that can be really deleterious, negative to the physiology as well, because our cells need glucose for energy, right? Particularly the brain, right? So really low blood sugar levels could also cause coma, seizure, and death. It can be really dangerous in an emergency situation, right? And it's really top of mind for individuals living with type 1 diabetes, because if there's problems with the pump, right, or it is insufficient insulin delivery, or mistiming, I should say, of the insulin delivery, we can overshoot, right, and wind up driving the blood sugar too low, right? So, and this is sometimes an issue for individuals, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but I want to make sure I allude to it now because it's kind of germane and topical here, is individuals hopefully are exercising. I'm an exercise guy. I'm a big advocate for exercise. But the interesting thing about exercise, this is a real brief, is exercise has, my students like this nickname, is what's referred to as a NIMGU response, non-insulin mediated glucose uptake. What the heck does that mean, right? Generally, how NIMGU operates, and it's fun to say, right? NIMGU operates, right? Interesting. We know about cell signaling. Once again, my arcs of death. I love my arcs of death, right? We know, right, from our story here that insulin can bind. I just kind of abbreviate insulin as INS, right? Insulin binds onto the insulin receptor, turns on this cell signaling. So we call this insulin-mediated cell signaling. We talked about AKT activation now, right? AKT, this enzyme or protein in the muscle, right? And glucose uptake, right? And glucose uptake. So AKT communicating to our GLUT molecule migrating to our cell membrane, right? And then glucose, I usually just put as a G, now migrates in, and it's facilitated diffusion. That's the cell signaling loop we just talked about, right? Insulin-mediated glucose uptake, right? Insulin-mediated, so not NIMGU, IMGU, IMGU, right? That's insulin-mediated glucose uptake. In addition to that, which is fascinating, which what NIMGU is, right? I'm going to put it as red, or a lightning bolt, is that when you exercise, right, which is what the lightning bolt is muscle contraction, right, or muscle stimulation. Muscle stimulation, right? So electrical stimulation of the muscle, right? What we know is other cell signaling pathways can get turned on, right? So this would be contraction or mechanical signaling. And it's fascinating. You make a muscle contract, right? A whole other series of molecules will get turned on. This mechanical signaling, right, will also converge on and activate AKT. So even in the absence of insulin, right, you can get glucose inside of the cell by making a muscle contract, right? Hopefully you can see the value of exercise for an individual who is living with type 1 diabetes, right? You exercise the muscle, even if insulin is insufficient, right? We can get glucose inside the cell by merely making the muscle contract. So by doing walking or push-ups or Pilates or yoga or whatever it may be, whatever your preferred activity is, we can help maintain glucose homeostasis in the blood by contracting the muscle and exercising. Okay? So that's NIMGU. That is NIMGU. Non-insulin mediated glucose uptake. Right? So it's a good thing. But the problem is we have to be careful for an individual. So if a student is in my class with type 1 diabetes, I encourage them to talk to me because they might be in the exercise physiology lab and doing exercise. And some of these labs are in the afternoon, right? They'll go and have lunch, right? Their insulin pump will administer a dose of insulin to bring the glucose level back down. But then they'll show up in the lab and do exercise, right? So if we map this out, right? Here's the glucose homeostasis, right? They had lunch. The blood glucose, which I'll abbreviate as BG, right? Blood glucose will rise. Insulin will get administered. Insulin levels will start to come back down, but then they'll exercise. I'll put it as a lightning bolt. So what will happen then, because of the NIMGU, now this is a problem, right? So individuals will feel dizzy and lightheaded. They will get nauseous. They can pass out, right? It could lead to even more severe seizures, coma, death, right? So this is a bad phenomenon. This is the hypoglycemia we're referring to. Is we've mistimed the administration of the insulin. We had a double whammy of insulin and exercise, and now the individual is hypoglycemic. And even individuals who are not living with type 1 diabetes can experience this phenomenon, right? We have to be careful. That's why they say don't swim after you eat. It's not necessarily about cramping. It's because we can cause hypoglycemia. You go and have lunch, insulin is secreted. The insulin pump in the pancreas, that's all the insulin pump is. It's a medical device. It's taking the place of the pancreas, right? So an individual who's not living with type 1 diabetes can exhibit the same situation. They can go swimming after eating and wind up being in the water, being lightheaded and dizzy and get nauseous and vomit because they are now hypoglycemic. The double whammy, I refer to it as muscle stimulation and insulin secretion, resulting in severe movement, too much movement of glucose out of the blood and into the tissue, all right? So the reason I'm bringing this up is because I like to tie it into a previous video. How do we kind of help to ensure this, right? To be able to respond to this hypoglycemia, right? What's the hormone? I'll give you a moment to think about it, right? What would be the hormone that you'd want to administer, right, as a medical intervention to help bring the sugar back up? It's a molecule we talked about previously in one of our previous discussions. So if you were in class right now, I'll give you a moment to think about what molecule you'd want to administer to help bring the sugar level back up, right, into homeostatic regulation, back into euglycemia. What would you administer to allow that to happen? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Time. Okay, what we're looking for here is glucagon. Glucagon. We can actually administer that. So individuals living with type 1 diabetes will often have an emergency kit on hand that's either injectable. There are various different types, and the students will oftentimes teach me how to administer that. So if they pass out, I can inject and administer glucagon, which we now know tells the liver to perform glycogenolysis and liberate the glucose and excrete it back into the blood. That's the job of glucagon. So individuals living with type 1 diabetes will have some sort of exogenous glucagon. There's also, it can come in an injectable form and also an oral form, right? A tablet, right? An oral tablet form, or sometimes, so an oral tablet could be if they haven't passed out and they're feeling dizzy, you can have a quick dissolving oral tablet, right? There's a tablet they can administer, but you wouldn't want to administer it if they're passed out and not able to swallow, right? It could be a problem, right? So injectables would be more suitable for that. But regardless, glucagon administration would be the intervention. That's what I really want you to know. I'm not going to quiz you on when would you do injectable versus an oral tablet. No, that's kind of superfluous, but I just want you to be aware of it. There's different versions of it, but the big picture item for purposes of our class is in individuals in particular who are type 1 diabetes. It's not just about insulin. We also have to make sure we're aware of glucagon. Glucagon is a remedy to help repair and prove a hypoglycemic condition when we overshoot the amount of insulin and we went up hypoglycemic. Okay, so good. All right, so a lot of information. I may have to break this up into two and tackle type 2 diabetes here in a second. Okay, but let me just get a new fresh page here for you. All right, so we know about a little bit about the prevalence, very prevalent condition. Other kind of supporting types of pieces of information, right? So we'll call it supplemental information about type 1 diabetes mellitus. Okay? It was previously, and still used, known as juvenile onset diabetes. Right? Juvenile onset, right? And the reason it was juvenile onset is largely most cases are in younger individuals. So most people are diagnosed and they're usually less than 40 years old, right? Usually it's in the teens, maybe even earlier than that, right? But it's less than, on the younger end of the spectrum is where diagnosis usually happens. Once again, it's usually younger, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14 years old, maybe up into the 20s is when most cases of type 1 diabetes mellitus are caught, diagnosed, right? That name is still used, right? There's the JDRF, right? The JDRF, the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. It's a big organization that's trying to find cures, right? Raise money, raise awareness for type 1 diabetes mellitus, right? It held on to the name because it's so well known. JDRF is such a well-known name that they didn't want to convert it. But the reason it got converted in the medical community from JDRF, from juvenile onset diabetes to type 1 is because the complications associated with the age, we're starting to see more and more individuals with juvenile onset diagnosed after the age of 40, right? And when we get to type 2 diabetes, most of those cases are after the age of 40, but there were so many cases that we call that adult onset. We'll get to that in the next section. Type 2 diabetes referred to as adult onset. Adult onset didn't make sense because there was so many young people getting diagnosed with. So it didn't make sense to hold on to the names of juvenile versus adult. It started to lose its specificity. So they transitioned to type 1, which was now juvenile onset, previously known as juvenile onset diabetes, and type 2, which is old school name is adult onset diabetes. Adult onset diabetes. Okay? So let me just check my notes. I know that's a lot of information I just foisted at you, right? In general, I think we'll kind of pause it here. I'm going to transition to type 2 diabetes in another section, in a separate section. I'm going to talk about general complications associated with it, signs and symptoms of diabetes, and then we'll dive into the type 2 diabetes complication. Okay? So hopefully you found that helpful. We'll circle back on a lot of this cell signaling and insulin-mediated types of responses, prevalence, and so forth. Okay? So enjoy that video, and I will be back soon.